What would you do if your own daughter wrote your obituary while you were still alive? That's not clickbait. That's not a movie plot. That's my life. My name is Henry Carter, and I've been a mechanic in Ohio for nearly 50 years. My hands have been stained with motor oil. My fingernails cracked from decades of honest work, the kind of work that paid for my daughter's law school education. I believed in family and loyalty and sacrifice. But for 28 years, my daughter, Laura Carter Mitchell, believed in something else, appearances, prestige, and pretending that I no longer existed. She buried me in words long before death ever had the chance. For nearly 3 decades, I was the ghost in her story. Every letter I sent came back stamped, returned to sender. Every birthday card for grandchildren I never met was tossed aside. I buried my wife Sarah alone because Laura didn't want her colleagues at the Meadowbrook Country Club to know she had a father who fixed cars for a living. That pain never left me. It stayed in a banker's box in my closet, every envelope cataloged, every rejection organized by year-like service records no one asked for. Then just 3 weeks ago, everything changed. My phone rang at 7:30 in the morning. The man on the other end was an attorney from Boston. My Uncle Robert had died suddenly of a heart attack. I braced myself for grief, but what came next nearly stopped my own heart. Uncle Robert had left me everything. An apartment building in Back Bay investment portfolios, cash accounts. The total $8.2 million. I had lived my whole life with enough, never rich, never desperate, just enough. And suddenly, with one phone call, I was a millionaire. Here's where the family drama turns into something darker. Because 3 days after that newspaper headline hit the local paper, mechanic inherits $8.2 million fortune, my daughter called me for the first time since 1995. Daddy, I've been thinking about you. Maybe it's time we put the past behind us. The kids are so excited to meet their grandfather. Her voice was sweet as honey, but it cut through me like broken glass. Think about it, 28 years of silence, and suddenly she wants me back. After she built her career on the fake obituary of my death, after she delivered speeches about losing her father too young, after she raised money in my memory, now she wanted a reunion. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about betrayal, about the kind of lies that rot a family from the inside out. It's a revenge story, yes, but more than that, it's a Thanksgiving reveal that no one at that perfect Tudor mansion will ever forget. So lean in, because what I uncovered about my own daughter's double life will make your blood run cold. And when I finally sat at her Thanksgiving table, surrounded by 12 of her closest friends and the husband who stayed silent, I didn't come empty-handed. I brought the evidence, I brought the truth, and I brought a check for $8.2 million that would end her lies forever. Family drama, betrayal, fake obituary, 8.2 on her inheritance. Thanksgiving revenge. This is my story, and it's going to get so much worse before it gets better. They say betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people you love most. In my case, that betrayal wasn't just abandonment, it was erasure. My daughter, Laura Carter Mitchell, didn't simply cut me out of her life, she killed me off on paper. And she did it in a way that not only destroyed the bond between us, but turned my supposed death into a foundation for her entire career. It started in 1997, just 2 years after she gave me the ultimatum change. My life become someone respectable in her eyes or stay gone. I still remember the smell of grease and rubber in my shop when I first heard about it. A neighbor slipped a newspaper under my garage door one morning. The headline wasn't bold, it wasn't front-page news, but it was enough to drop me to my knees. Thomas Carter, 57, of Oakdale, dies in single-car accident on Route 9. The obituary read like a neatly wrapped package of lies. It listed Laura as my grieving daughter, her husband Andrew as the supportive son-in-law, and even suggested donations be made to a local charity in memory of Henry Carter, a hard-working father and mechanic. I read my own obituary 3 times before my hands started shaking. My face went pale, my chest tightened. I was alive, standing right there in my garage, holding a greasy wrench in one hand and my death notice in the other. She hadn't called me. She hadn't written me. She hadn't even warned me. She had simply decided that the easiest way to explain my absence was to bury me in print. That was her solution, a fake obituary. It didn't stop with the paper. Word spread quickly. At the Meadowbrook Country Club, where she and Andrew had climbed their way into the upper crust, Laura told friends and colleagues that her father had died tragically when she was still young. At first it was whispers of pity, Poor Laura, she lost her father too soon, but pity in her hands turned into power. She gave speeches about resilience after tragedy, about how losing her father shaped her values, about how his memory inspired her legal career. And every year she doubled down. She donated small amounts in my name, always publicly, always with a smile that suggested sainthood. $500 to Big Brothers Big Sisters in memory of Henry Carter. $1,000 to the local Boys and Girls Club dedicated to her late father. She built a reputation as a woman forged in grief who had turned pain into purpose. Meanwhile, I was alive just a few miles away, eating alone in my kitchen, keeping every returned letter stacked in manila folders. The betrayal dug deeper each time I heard secondhand accounts. Old friends would stop by my shop confused, saying, "Henry, we thought you'd passed." Others looked at me like a ghost, unsure whether to hug me or back away. It was humiliating. My daughter had rewritten my story without my consent, without my truth, and the world believed her version. It wasn't just a personal lie, it was a professional strategy. At her law firm, Laura was admired as the brilliant attorney who overcame hardship. She wrote articles for the Bar Association Journal titled Finding Strength in Loss. She was invited to conferences where she told rooms full of lawyers about the tragedy of losing her father and how it inspired her dedication to justice. I sometimes wondered if she ever stopped mid-speech and thought about me sitting in my garage covered in oil flipping through her lies in the local paper. But the most painful cut of all was her children, my grandchildren, Emily and Daniel. They grew up believing their grandfather had died in a car crash before they were old enough to remember. They wrote essays in school about the grandfather they never met, the man who supposedly sacrificed everything and was taken too soon. My name, my existence became a ghost story told at dinner parties, a myth Laura used to polish her reputation. The first time I heard that she'd spoken at a country club memorial event, I felt something break inside me. She stood before an audience wearing pearls and an expensive dress and spoke moving words about the hard-working father who raised her. She described me in past tense as if I were buried under 6 feet of dirt instead of under fluorescent lights fixing transmissions. She ended her speech with tears in her eyes, saying she just wished her children could have known me. And the audience, none the wiser, gave her a standing ovation. That was the genius and cruelty of her betrayal. She didn't just cut me out, she weaponized my absence. She turned me into a symbol, a character in her family drama, a dead man whose memory could be leveraged for social standing. She cashed in sympathy, built a career on resilience, all while I lived in the shadows. It wasn't shame anymore. It was convenience. It was easier to tell the world I was dead than admit she'd abandoned me. For 28 years, I carried that truth like a scar. I didn't fight back because who would believe me? A mechanic with grease-stained hands versus a polished attorney in designer suits. If I shouted, I would sound bitter. If I stayed silent, at least I could hold on to dignity. So I chose silence. But silence doesn't erase betrayal, it preserves it, waiting for the day truth can finally explode. That day was coming, and though Laura didn't know it, her carefully woven tapestry of lies was about to unravel. The fake obituary was the cornerstone of her empire, and I now had proof. I had the newspaper clipping the plaque at the country club, the speeches, the donations. I had decades of evidence boxed and labeled. And when the time came, when I walked into her house on Thanksgiving Day with a briefcase in my hand, she wouldn't be able to laugh it off, charm it away, or bury me again. Betrayal is a wound, but betrayal exposed in public becomes justice. And I was ready to deliver that justice, not just for myself, but for every letter returned to sender, for every lonely birthday, and for every lie my daughter told in my name. When the phone rang the second time, I knew exactly what voice I would hear. It had been 28 years since my daughter Laura had called me, but I would have recognized that careful, rehearsed tone anywhere. "Daddy," she said, sweet as syrup dripping with false warmth. "I've been thinking about you so much lately. The kids are asking about their grandfather. Maybe it's time we start fresh. Maybe you could join us for Thanksgiving dinner." Thanksgiving dinner. 2 words that should have meant family comfort and gratitude. But coming from Laura, they sounded like an invitation to a play, and I was being cast as the lead prop. She spoke quickly like a politician at a podium, weaving in the idea that her children, Emily and Daniel, were desperate to meet me, that her husband, Andrew, thought it was the perfect moment for reconciliation. Yet every sentence felt staged, This wasn't about love or family. This was about optics. This was about showing her elite friends that she had a father again, and that father came complete with an 8.2 Mentor's inheritance headline attached to his name. I didn't answer right away. I let her fill the silence with nervous chatter. She explained that it would be a small gathering, just family, and then, almost as an afterthought, she slipped in the names of a dozen guests: the Hendersons, the Davises, Dr. Richard Martinez and his wife. All of them country club regulars, the kind of people who had believed for decades that I was dead. Family drama in its most twisted form, resurrecting me only to parade me before her social circle. I could hear the strain in her voice as she tried to sound casual. "Daddy, the kids are dying to meet you. They've heard so much about you." And that's when it hit me. They hadn't heard the truth about me. They'd heard her version, the fake obituary version, the version where I was a memory, a tragic story, a tool for her speeches and charity fundraisers. Now she wanted to flip the script, make me her redemption arc, the dutiful daughter who forgave her long-lost father just in time for the holidays. I agreed to come, but not for the reasons she thought. I told her I'd bring a friend, my neighbor and brother-in-arms, Frank Miller. She hesitated, her tone stiffening for the first time. "Bring someone? Well, of course. But Daddy, does he know about your recent good fortune?" There it was again. The money. The real reason she had pulled me from the grave. I kept my voice calm. "Frank doesn't care about money. He's just a good friend. The kind of friend who's been there when no one else was." The days leading up to Thanksgiving felt heavy, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I knew Laura wasn't planning a private reunion. She was staging a performance. Martha Thompson, a waitress at the country club, who had trusted me with her Buick for years, slipped me a napkin one afternoon. On it, in shaky handwriting, she wrote what she'd overheard at a lunch between Laura and her wealthy friends. Laura had told them I was the one who reached out, that I had been struggling with pride and regret, that I had finally realized family was more important than grudges. She painted herself as the forgiving daughter, magnanimous enough to let her stubborn father back into her perfect world. I stared at that napkin for a long time. Evidence plain as day. Laura wasn't just lying to her friends. She was rewriting history in real time, twisting the story so she came out the saint. She made me the broken old man crawling back for acceptance, and she made herself the redeemer. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was public. By the time Thanksgiving morning came, I had already made up my mind. This wouldn't be a dinner. This would be a Thanksgiving reveal. I would walk into that Tudor-style mansion, not as the prop she expected, but as the witness to 28 years of truth. And I would not come empty-handed. I would bring the black leather briefcase Mark Reynolds, the private investigator, had helped me fill. Inside were copies of the fake obituary screenshots of her social media posts, transcripts of her speeches, receipts of donations made in my memory. It was the arsenal of truth. Frank and I drove up in my old F-150, the truck looking like a relic parked among shiny BMWs and Teslas in the circular driveway. Laura answered the door in a cashmere sweater and pearls, throwing her arms around me as though the cameras were already rolling. "Daddy," she cried out for everyone to hear. Over her shoulder, I saw the living room crowded with well-dressed guests holding crystal wine glasses, faces full of curiosity. For them, it was a resurrection moment. For me, it was a stage set with velvet curtains and false smiles. "Everyone," Laura announced proudly, "my father's here." The room went silent. A few gasps, a few awkward claps. One woman whispered, "But I thought he'd passed years ago." Laura laughed it off, calling it a miscommunication. She introduced me to the country club president, to the Davises, to Dr. Martinez. Each handshake was awkward, each smile forced. I wasn't a guest, I was an exhibit. At the dinner table, they seated me at the head as though I were a king returning from exile. Laura hovered nearby, filling glasses, touching my shoulder, laughing too loudly. She was performing affection with every gesture. To her friends, it looked like reconciliation. To me, it felt like chains tightening around my dignity. Every time someone asked about my past, Laura jumped in to control the narrative. "Daddy's always been so modest. He worked in automotive services, very successful. Not a mechanic, never a mechanic." That word was too dirty for her table. As I sat there staring at the Waterford crystal and bone china, I realized the depth of her scheme. Laura hadn't invited me to be her father. She had invited me to be her proof. Proof that she was compassionate, forgiving, graceful under pressure. Proof that she could resurrect her father just in time to burnish her reputation. I was a prop in her play, nothing more. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just there to sit quietly and play along. This was a revenge story, and the stage she built for me would become her undoing. People think grief comes all at once like a thunderclap that shakes your bones and then fades away. But grief, at least in my life, came in envelopes. Thin white envelopes stamped with two cruel words, "Return to sender." Those three words became the chorus of my life for nearly 3 decades. After Laura gave me her ultimatum in 1995 and walked away from my garage in that expensive suit, I refused to believe she meant it forever. I kept writing to her. At first it was every week, then every month, then holidays, birthdays, milestones. Every letter had hope sealed inside a father's hope that maybe this time she would open it. Maybe this time she would see that grease on my hands didn't make me less of a man, less of a father. But one by one they came back. The first Christmas card, the first birthday card, the college graduation letter I mailed when I heard she'd passed the bar exam. Each envelope was stamped in red ink like a wound across my heart. Return to sender. At first I cried. Later I just filed them away because I didn't know what else to do. I bought banker's boxes and manila folders. I labeled them by year 1996, 4 letters returned. 1911, 6 letters returned. 2010 graduation card for my granddaughter Emily, returned unopened. That box became my secret archive of heartbreak. When people asked why I kept it, I couldn't explain. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was proof that I hadn't abandoned my daughter, proof that I had tried again and again. Proof that it wasn't me who walked away. And then there was Sarah, my wife, my partner in everything. She used to beg me to stop torturing myself. "Henry, she's made her choice. You're only hurting yourself." She would find me at the kitchen table staring at an envelope with Laura's name on it, my handwriting shaky from hope and fear. Sarah would rest her hand on mine and whisper, "She'll come back when she's ready." But she never did. When Sarah got sick, I thought about calling Laura, about telling her the truth before it was too late. But I remembered the way she looked at me that last day in 1995, disgust in her eyes at the grease under my nails. I couldn't bear the thought of being rejected again, so I buried my wife alone. Just me, a few old friends, and the neighbor from the shop next door. No daughter to cry at her mother's grave, no grandchildren to place flowers. Laura didn't even know Sarah had died because by then we hadn't spoken in 18 years. I can still see that funeral like it was yesterday. Cold wind, gray sky, me clutching a folded flag they handed me at the cemetery because Sarah had been the daughter of a veteran. I went home that night and set her photograph on the kitchen table beside one of those returned letters. That became my ritual, her picture and an unopened letter sitting side by side like companions in grief. Sometimes when the loneliness pressed in too hard, I would take out the box and spread the envelopes across the table. It looked like an autopsy report on my family year by year, a record of rejection. There was one envelope that haunted me more than the others. It was from 2018, Laura's 40th birthday. I had written about Sarah, about how proud she always was of Laura's success. I wrote that Sarah kept a scrapbook of Laura's newspaper clippings. That envelope came back like the rest, but there were small pencil marks in the corner, as if someone had started to open it, then thought better of it. For years I stared at that one letter and wondered, did she read it? Did she hesitate? Did a part of her still care? The truth is, silence became a second skin. When the phone didn't ring on Christmas, I told myself, maybe next year. When birthdays passed without a word, I whispered that she was busy. I convinced myself over and over that family bonds were stronger than pride, that sooner or later, love would win. But the years piled up and love never called. Meanwhile, Laura was telling the world I was dead. While I was sitting in my kitchen counting rejection slips, she was standing in front of an audience telling them how much she missed me. She had killed me off in her story, and all I had were the envelopes to prove I was still alive. That's the part of the family drama no one sees. Not the headlines, not the fortune, not even the betrayal at the Thanksgiving table. The real drama was in the quiet nights when I sat with a cold cup of coffee staring at Sarah's picture, replaying every moment of my daughter's childhood. Her laughter as a little girl, when I lifted her onto my shoulders at the county fair. The way she used to run into my arms smelling like crayons and grass. All of it felt like another life, a life buried under 3 cruel words, Return to sender. For 28 years, I carried that pain alone. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I didn't beg. I just kept the evidence like a mechanic keeps service records. And deep down, I believed that someday, somehow, the truth would matter. That my silence would not be the end of the story. And now with Thanksgiving looming and my daughter inviting me back into her perfect world, I knew the silence was about to break. The years of unopened letters of grief, of loneliness, all of it was fuel. And when I finally sat at that long mahogany table, it wouldn't just be me she was facing. It would be the ghost of every letter she refused to read, every truth she tried to bury. Because silence can be mistaken for weakness. But silence, when held long enough, becomes a weapon. And I was ready to use mine. After the second phone call from Laura, I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, Sarah's photograph, beside the box of returned letters staring into the dark. My daughter's voice echoed in my head, syrupy sweet but trembling at the edges. "Daddy, the kids are so excited to meet you." I had waited 28 years to hear those words, but instead of warming me, they chilled me, because I knew she wasn't telling the truth. And if I was going to walk into her Tudor mansion on Thanksgiving Day, I wanted to be armed with something more than memory and hurt feelings. So the next morning, I made a call to a man I hadn't spoken to in years. Mark Reynolds, a classmate from high school, who had gone into police work and later opened his own private investigation office above Miller's Deli on Main Street. Mark was one of those people you could trust with ugly truths. He'd seen enough in uniform to know that the neat stories people tell are rarely the whole story. When I walked into his office, it smelled like old coffee and burnt paper. The blinds were half closed and stacks of folders lined his desk. He looked up surprised. "Henry Carter." "I'll be damned. Haven't seen you since Sarah's funeral. How have you been holding up?" I swallowed hard. "I've been alive, Mark. More alive than my daughter tells people anyway." He frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" I told him everything. About Laura's sudden calls after the $8.2 million inheritance. About the years of silence, the returned letters, and the rumors I'd been hearing, whispers that she had told people I was dead. I told him about Martha Thompson's napkin note from the country club, where Laura had spun a tale about me begging to reconcile, and I told him about the Thanksgiving invitation that smelled like a trap. "I want to know the truth," I said. "I want to know exactly what she's been telling people for 28 years. Her friends, her colleagues, those country club people. I need every detail." Mark sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Henry, sometimes it's better not to know." I shook my head. "I've spent nearly 3 decades wondering what I did wrong. I think a few $1,000s is a small price to pay for the truth." He nodded slowly. "My rate is 100 an hour plus expenses. A job like this, 25, maybe 30 hours. You're looking at $2,500. I thought about Uncle Robert, about the fortune he had left me, because I was the only family member who stayed true to myself. Then I thought about the box of envelopes at home. "It's worth every penny," I said. Mark got to work immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, while Laura called me twice more to rehearse her false sweetness, Mark was digging under the hood of her perfect life. He called me on November 8th. "Henry, I've got your information, but you're going to want to sit down for this." The next morning, I was back in his office. He handed me a thick manila folder. On the top was a photograph, a screenshot from Laura's private social media page. She was at a charity gala standing next to Andrew, Emily, and Daniel. The caption froze my blood, "Supporting the Children's Hospital fundraiser every year in memory of my father, who always believed in helping others." "In memory of," I whispered. My hands trembled. Mark's voice was grim. "It gets worse. She's been telling people you died in 1997. There's even an obituary type submitted, published in the Meadowbrook Gazette. I pulled the archives. You should see this." He slid the paper across the desk. There it was in black and white. Thomas Carter, 57, of Oakdale, dies Tuesday, March 15th, in a single-car accident on Route 9. It listed Laura and Andrew as survivors. It even asked for donations to Big Brothers Big Sisters in my name. I felt my chest tighten. My own death printed for the world to believe. My life turned into a prop for my daughter's narrative. Mark kept going. He laid out charity receipts, articles she'd written, speeches she had given. A timeline emerged, the lies evolving year by year. In the late 90s, she had simply said I was gone. By the early 2000s, I was a tragic accident. By the 2010s, I was a saint, the hardworking father who sacrificed everything for her career. She had even monetized my death, making annual donations in my memory tax write-offs, dressed up as grief. And it wasn't just her friends or colleagues. Her own children had grown up on the lie. Emily had written a 10th grade essay titled The Grandfather I Never Knew. Daniel had once told a school counselor how sad he felt that his mother lost her father so young. By the time I closed the folder, I was shaking. But for the first time in years, it wasn't just with grief. It was with clarity. The story was there, documented, undeniable. The family drama Laura had orchestrated was about to unravel. Mark pushed the folder toward me. "What are you going to do with this, Henry?" I stood up, tucking it under my arm. "I'm going to take it to Thanksgiving dinner. I'm going to put it right on the table next to her turkey and her crystal wine glasses." When I left Mark's office, I drove straight to Frank Miller's place. Frank had been my neighbor and closest friend for 20 years, the kind of man who told you the truth even when it hurt. When I spread the folder across his kitchen table, he read in silence, his face darkening with every page. Finally, he looked at me. "Jesus Christ, Henry. She's been telling people you're dead for 26 years, and now she wants you to show up smiling so she can look like a hero in front of her friends." I nodded. "That's exactly why I need you there, Frank. I need a witness. Someone who knows the truth, someone who can't be swayed by her charm." He leaned back, his jaw set. "You sure about this? These are rich people, powerful people. Andrew's a respected doctor. She's got connections all over town." I thought of Sarah's picture, the framed letter with pencil marks in the corner, the banker's box of returned mail. I thought of Uncle Robert's voice in my memory telling me I was the only one who stayed true. Then I looked Frank in the eye. "I've been dead for 26 years. What more can they take from me?" He gave a short nod. "Then let's give them a Thanksgiving they'll never forget." Thanksgiving Day arrived with the kind of gray Ohio sky that pressed down on your shoulders. Frank Miller sat beside me in my old F-150, the leather briefcase between us like a loaded weapon. The circular driveway of Laura's Tudor mansion glittered with BMWs, Mercedes, a Porsche 911, even a Tesla humming silently. My truck looked like an intruder on foreign soil. Frank glanced at me. "Henry, you sure about this?" I patted the briefcase. Never been more sure of anything in my life. Laura opened the door, wearing pearls and a cream-colored cashmere sweater, her smile wide enough to crack glass. "Daddy," she cried, arms outstretched. She hugged me tight, not for me, but for the audience watching from the living room. Over her shoulder, I saw them 12 well-dressed guests holding crystal glasses, curious eyes fixed on the man they thought had been dead for 26 years. "Everyone," Laura announced proudly, "my father's here." The room went silent. A woman in black cocktail dress whispered, "But I thought he passed away years ago." Laura laughed lightly. "A misunderstanding. Miscommunication, really. Families are complicated." She brushed it off like it was a scheduling error. My stomach turned. They sat me at the head of the table, the supposed guest of honor. Laura hovered near me, her hand resting on my shoulder, her laughter too loud, too rehearsed. Every gesture was for show. The table sparkled with Waterford crystal silver candlesticks, a centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage once did. To her friends, this was the perfect family drama redemption arc, the dutiful daughter welcoming back her long-lost father. To me, it was a stage, and I was done being her prop. Dinner began with polite questions. "What do you do, Mr. Carter?" asked Mrs. Henderson, her diamond earrings flashing. Before I could open my mouth, Laura answered for me. "Automotive services, very successful. Not mechanic, never mechanic." That word was too dirty for her table. Then came the toast. Laura stood, her wine glass raised, her eyes glistening. "Everyone, I'd like to propose a toast. To my father, who has always been my hero and my inspiration. To second chances. To family." The guests raised their glasses. To family. I stood too, holding my glass, my heart pounding. "Thank you, Laura. That was beautiful. Truly. And I've been looking forward to this moment for a very long time. The chance to meet all these wonderful people who've heard so much about me over the years." I paused, scanning their faces. In fact, I'm curious. "What exactly have you all heard about me?" The table went still. Mr. Davis cleared his throat. "Well, she's spoken of you often with admiration. She said you sacrificed everything for her education, that you'd be so proud. Past tense, I said softly. Would be proud. Interesting choice of words. I reached down, unlatched the briefcase, and set it on the table. Laura's smile froze. Mrs. Henderson, I said, sliding a folded newspaper clipping across the polished wood. You've known my daughter a long time. What has she told you about her family? Mrs. Henderson glanced nervously at Laura, then at the paper. She said you died in the late 90s, a car accident. That's right, I said, a car accident. I nodded at the clipping. This car accident. Gasps echoed as Mrs. Henderson read the obituary, her face draining of color. She passed it to Dr. Martinez, who passed it to the next guest. It was my obituary published in 1997, declaring me dead at 57. Laura's voice cracked. Daddy, what are you doing? I'm telling the truth, sweetheart. Something in short supply around here. I pulled more papers from the briefcase. The timeline Mark Reynolds had compiled, the charity receipts, the articles Laura had written about grief and resilience. For 28 years, my daughter has told the world I was dead. She's given speeches about me, written articles, even raised money in my memory. She built a career on my corpse while I was alive, just a few miles away. The room erupted in whispers. Dr. Martinez's wife stared at Laura, stunned. But you told us, Laura cut in, her voice, sharp, desperate. He was unstable. He had problems after my mother died. I had to protect my children. You don't understand. I slammed a stack of returned letters on the table. Envelopes yellowed with age, each stamped "Return to Sender." I tried. For 28 years I tried. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations. Every letter came back unopened. You didn't protect your children, Laura. You lied to them. You lied to everyone here. You buried me alive because you were ashamed of what I did for a living. Frank stood up at the far end of the table, his voice steady. I've known Henry Carter for 20 years. He's the most honest, hard-working man I've ever met. And you all have been mourning a man who was sitting right next door, grieving the daughter who pretended he didn't exist. The silence was suffocating. Laura's cheeks were flushed, her eyes wild. She looked less like a lawyer and more like someone whose mask had finally cracked. You had no right, she spat. You had no right to come here and destroy my life. Your life, I held up one last document, a check. You built your life on my death. And now I'll build my legacy on truth. I lifted the check so every eye could see the bold black ink, $200,000 made payable to Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America. Gasps. Forks clattered. One guest covered her mouth. I'm donating every penny of my inheritance to children who don't have fathers in their lives. Children like my grandchildren who were told their grandfather was dead. You had 28 years to have a father, Laura. You chose a corpse instead. I closed the briefcase, tucked the check back inside, and stood tall. This is the Thanksgiving reveal you wanted. The family reunion, the redemption arc. Only this time it's the truth. Sarah, my granddaughter, whispered, Mom, is it true? Daniel looked at me with wide, broken eyes. And for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of silence lifting. I turned to them gently. I've been here all along, kids. Your mother just never wanted you to know me. Then I looked back at Laura, whose tears now were not of sorrow, but of rage. The show's over, sweetheart. The fallout came faster than even I expected. By the time Frank and I drove away from Laura's Tudor mansion that Thanksgiving afternoon, I knew her perfect world was already cracking. The silence in that dining room had been deafening. 12 guests had watched her mask fall off, had read my obituary with their own eyes, had heard her stumble through excuses that collapsed under the weight of evidence. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth had spoken for itself. The very next morning, Martha Thompson, the country club waitress who had warned me before, stopped by my garage. She pressed a folded note into my hands, her eyes wide. Henry, you've started something, she whispered. I opened the note. Inside, scribbled in her familiar handwriting, were words that made me sit down on my work stool. 3 families had already called the country club to cancel their holiday reservations. They said they didn't want their names tied to the woman who faked her father's death for 28 years. By Sunday, the whispers had become a storm. Meadowbrook is a small community, and gossip there spreads faster than engine oil on concrete. Everyone who had been at that Thanksgiving dinner started telling their version of the story. By Monday morning, it wasn't whispers anymore. It was headlines. The Meadowbrook Gazette ran with the story, "First Mechanic Exposes Daughter's 28-Year Lie at Thanksgiving Dinner." By Tuesday, the Cleveland Herald picked it up, calling it one of the most shocking cases of social betrayal in recent memory. The articles painted Laura not as a successful attorney, but as a fraud. They highlighted her speeches about resilience after tragedy, her charity donations in my memory, her carefully crafted narrative of grief, and then contrasted it with the truth. One reporter even came by my garage with a camera crew. I stood there in my oil-stained coveralls next to Frank, holding the banker's box full of returned letters. "Why did you keep all these?" the reporter asked. I looked into the lens and said, "Because I needed proof that I never gave up on my daughter, even when she gave up on me." That line made the evening news. The country club plaque came down quietly a week later. Martha told me she saw groundskeepers at dawn removing the bronze plate that read, "In memory of Thomas Carter, beloved father." She said they didn't even tell Laura beforehand. They just ripped it out of the garden wall and hauled it away. For decades, that plaque had been a lie carved in metal. Now it was gone, and with it the illusion Laura had built for her elite friends. Her marriage collapsed just as quickly. Dr. Andrew Mitchell filed for legal separation on November 30th. Word was he told colleagues he couldn't stay married to someone who had built her reputation on an elaborate fiction. It wasn't just about me. He said it was about the years of lies, the manipulation, the way she used everyone around her like chess pieces. He didn't want his medical career tied to her scandal. By Christmas, Laura was living alone in that mansion, her pearl necklaces and cashmere sweaters offering no comfort. At the garage, life stayed simple. Cars came in, cars went out. But customers started bringing me coffee pies, even Christmas cards with notes. "We saw you on the news, Henry. You did the right thing." People honked when they drove past, waving, like I was some kind of local hero. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a tired old man who had finally spoken aloud the truth he'd carried too long. But if the world wanted to see me as a symbol of honesty, I could live with that. Laura, meanwhile, became a pariah. She stopped showing up to the country club. The law firm quietly removed her from the featured attorneys page on their website. Her so-called friends avoided her in the grocery store aisles. Even the charity organizations she'd once supported in my name distanced themselves, issuing statements that they could not condone deceptive fundraising practices. And then there was the donation. The check I'd shown at the table, $8.2 million to Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America, cleared by early December. The charity held a press conference thanking Henry Carter, a mechanic from Ohio, whose generosity will change the lives of countless children. They didn't mention Laura. They didn't have to. The contrast was already clear. Her $500 donation in 1997 meant to prop up a lie versus my millions given in truth. The more the story spread, the more people called it a revenge story. That wasn't the word I would have chosen. For me, it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. It was about reminding my grandchildren that their grandfather wasn't a ghost, wasn't a cautionary tale, wasn't a man to be pitied in past tense. I was real. I was alive. And I had the right to my own story. Still, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction I felt watching the dominoes fall. The woman who had laughed at me in my garage in 1995, who had gestured at my tools like they were shackles, who had buried me on paper. Because I embarrassed her, that woman was now the subject of scandal, not admiration. Her empire of lies collapsed under the weight of the truth she thought would never surface. As the weeks passed, the noise quieted. Reporters moved on to other stories. The country club planned new holiday galas this time without Laura's name on any committee lists. But the consequences lingered. Her once spotless reputation was tarnished beyond repair. Her marriage was over. And every time she looked at her children, she had to face the truth she had stolen their grandfather from them for 28 years. And me, I went back to work. Because that's what mechanics do. We fix what we can, and we live with what we can't. The betrayal would always scar me. But at least now the scar was visible to everyone. It was about 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving reveal when my phone finally rang again. Not with Laura's voice this time, hers I'd already learned to ignore. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something in my chest told me to pick up. "Grandpa." The voice on the other end was soft, uncertain. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. No one had called me that word in almost 3 decades. This is Emily. I'm sorry to bother you, but can we meet? I sat at my kitchen table staring at Sarah's framed photograph. My wife had never lived to hear her grandchildren call me by my rightful name. Now finally here it was. Of course, I said, my voice breaking. Of course, sweetheart. Where do you want to meet? She suggested a coffee shop near the university she attended. When I walked in that Saturday afternoon, she was already there sitting with her brother Daniel. They both looked nervous, shifting in their seats, clutching paper cups like shields. When they saw me, they stood awkwardly. For the first time, I saw my daughter's eyes without her lies clouding them, reflected in Emily and Daniel, but softer, unspoiled by years of pretense. Grandpa Daniel said, voice quiet, "We're sorry." I sat down across from them, folding my calloused hands on the table. "You don't need to be sorry. You didn't do anything wrong." But we believed her. Emily said, her eyes wet. "All these years, we thought you died before we could remember you. We wrote essays in school, lit candles at church, listened to Mom tell stories about how you were the greatest father but taken too soon. And then we saw you alive at our table." The pain in her voice was raw, like an old wound reopening. I nodded slowly. "Your mother wanted a story that made her look good. She wanted to be the daughter who overcame tragedy. It was easier for her to say I was dead than to admit she was ashamed of me. That's the truth." Daniel clenched his jaw. "She lied to us about everything. Do you know what that feels like? To find out your whole life has been based on a lie." I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. "Yes, son, I do. For 28 years, I lived that lie too. I buried your grandmother alone because your mother didn't even know she died. I wrote letters every birthday, every Christmas, and everyone came back stamped, 'Return to sender.' I kept them all because I wanted proof that I never stopped trying." Emily wiped her eyes. "Can we see them?" "The letters?" "Of course," I said. "I'll show you everything. Not because I need you to believe me, but because you deserve to know the truth." The following week, they came by my garage. I had cleared the workbench, laid out the banker's box, the folders neatly labeled by year. Emily lifted one envelope, turning it over in her hands. "You wrote to me when I was 10, she whispered, and she sent it back." Daniel's fists tightened. "She stole our grandfather from us." I swallowed hard. She thought she was protecting her image, but in the process, she robbed all of us. Me of you, you of me, and herself of peace. That's what lies do. They don't protect, they poison. For hours we sat in that garage drinking coffee Frank had brought over, flipping through years of unopened letters. Emily asked questions about Sarah, her grandmother she'd never known. I told them about Sarah's laugh, about the way she saved every newspaper clipping, of Laura's successes, about how she prayed every night that her daughter would come back. Daniel asked about Laura as a child. I told him about the county fairs, the scraped knees the nights she fell asleep in my lap, while I smelled of gasoline and engine oil. "I don't hate her," Emily said finally. "She's still our mother, but I can't look at her the same anymore." I nodded. That's the hardest part about family drama like this. You can still love someone, but you don't have to excuse their betrayal. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. Daniel looked at me. "So what happens now?" I thought of Sarah's picture, of the silence I'd carried for so long. "Now we start again. I can't give you back 28 years, but I can give you today and tomorrow and every story about your grandmother that your mother never told. I can teach you how to fix an engine, how to stand on your own 2 feet. I can give you the truth. That's all I ever wanted." When they left that evening, Emily hugged me tight, tears in her eyes. "I'm glad you're alive, Grandpa," she whispered. Daniel shook my hand firm, steady. "We'll come back," he promised. And in that moment, something inside me healed. Not completely, betrayal leaves scars too deep for that. But the silence that had weighed me down for nearly 3 decades finally cracked open. My grandchildren, stolen from me by lies, had found their way to my door. They hadn't come for money or for reputation or for appearances. They came for the truth. And for the first time since 1995, I believed that truth might finally be enough. A month after Thanksgiving, Emily and Daniel showed up at my garage on a chilly Saturday morning. They wore work gloves, their faces set with determination. "Grandpa, Emily said we think it's time to take something back." Together we drove to the Meadowbrook Country Club. The winter sun glinted off the manicured lawns, but the plaque on the stone wall still read, "In memory of Thomas Carter, beloved father." A memorial to a man who had never been dead. A lie carved in bronze. Daniel pulled out a wrench while Emily steadied the ladder. I climbed up slowly, my hands gripping the cold metal. As the bolts came loose one by one, I felt the weight of decades lift from my chest. Finally, with a metallic groan, the plaque slid free. I held it in my hands and turned it over, heavy, empty, meaningless. Grandpa, Emily whispered, "This never should have existed." "No," I said softly, lowering it to the ground. "But it did, and now it doesn't." We carried it back to the truck, drove to the garage, and set it down on the oil-stained concrete. Around us, engines hummed, tools clinked, the smell of grease and gasoline filled the air. It was the scent of the life I had lived honestly, without lies, without shame. I looked at my grandchildren and said, "This garage may not shine like marble floors, but every bolt, every scar, every dollar earned here is real." Dignity doesn't need a plaque. Truth doesn't need an audience. And family doesn't need a lie to survive. For the first time in 28 years, I felt free, not because I had destroyed my daughter's reputation, but because I had reclaimed my own. And here's what I want to leave you with. Sometimes the sharpest revenge is simply living your truth where everyone once buried you. If this story struck a chord with you, let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters. Save this video if you ever need a reminder that lies don't win forever. And if stories like this speak to your soul, hit subscribe because there are more truths, more lessons, and more victories waiting to be told.